The air over Guadalcanal smelled of rain and rot. Thick jungle foliage exhaled moisture into the night sky, wrapping the earth in a humid darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Above the canopy, where the stars should have pierced through, clouds hung low and oppressive. No moon, no light, only the kind of blackness that made men disappear 3 feet from where they stood. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya sat in the cockpit of his Mitsubishi G4M bomber, hands steady on the controls, eyes scanning an invisible horizon. Around him, 17 other bombers flew in loose formation, their engines droning in a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing. They were ghosts moving through the void, unseen, untouchable, protected by the ancient and reliable cloak of night. For centuries, darkness had been the warrior's ally. The samurai understood this. So did the shinobi, and so did the Imperial Japanese Navy. Night meant advantage, it meant surprise, it meant survival. When American forces occupied Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the Japanese had adapted quickly. Daylight bombing runs were suicide. American fighters tore through formations like wolves through sheep. But at night, the Americans were blind, their pilots grounded, their anti-aircraft guns firing wildly at sounds and shadows. At night, Japan still owned the sky. Itaya adjusted his altitude slightly, trusting his instruments, trusting the darkness. In 40 minutes, they would reach Henderson Field. They would drop their payloads on the runway, on the fuel depots, on the sleeping Americans who thought themselves safe. Then they would vanish back into the night, back to Rabaul, untouched and unchallenged. It was a routine they had perfected over months. The Americans called these raids Washing Machine Charlie for the irregular droning sound the unsynchronized engines made. A nickname born of frustration, not fear, because every night the bombers came, and every night they escaped. What Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya did not know, what none of the 18 crews knew, was that 500 miles away, inside a cramped operations tent on Guadalcanal, a young radar operator named Technical Sergeant Robert Moss was watching them. Not with his eyes, not through binoculars or searchlights, but on a glowing green screen where 18 bright dots moved steadily across a grid of phosphorescent light. Each dot was a bomber. Each bomber was visible. The night no longer protected them. Japan had entered the war with a doctrine built on spiritual superiority and tactical cunning. The Bushido Code emphasized honor, discipline, and the willingness to die for the emperor. But it also emphasized deception, surprise, and the exploitation of enemy weakness. Night operations were a natural extension of this philosophy. The Imperial Japanese Navy had trained its pilots in night flying and night combat more extensively than any other nation. They had developed specialized tactics, specialized equipment, and a cultural confidence that darkness was their domain. This confidence was not unfounded. At the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, Japanese cruisers had annihilated an Allied naval force under cover of darkness, sinking 4 heavy cruisers in less than an hour. American radar had been primitive, poorly understood, and incorrectly deployed. The Japanese had moved like phantoms through the night, their crews trained to fight without searchlights, their gunnery crews able to acquire targets by starlight and the faint glow of bow waves. It was a devastating demonstration of what night superiority could achieve. On Guadalcanal, that same doctrine applied to the air. Every night, bombers from Rabaul made the long flight south, using darkness as both shield and weapon. American pilots would scramble in desperation, climbing blind into the black sky, searching for engine sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Anti-aircraft batteries would fire at phantoms, searchlight crews would sweep empty sky, and the Japanese bombers would drop their ordnance and disappear, back into the void. The Americans were exhausted, sleep-deprived, frustrated. The nightly raids didn't inflict catastrophic damage, but they didn't need to. They eroded morale. They disrupted operations. They reminded the Americans that night still belonged to Japan. But in the winter of 1943, something had changed, something the Japanese High Command had not anticipated, had not understood, and could not see. America had brought radar. The technology was not new. British scientists had pioneered it before the war, using radio waves to detect incoming German bombers during the Battle of Britain. The principle was simple: transmit a radio pulse, wait for it to bounce off a solid object, measure the time it took to return, and calculate distance and direction. On a cathode ray screen, those calculations became glowing dots. Aircraft became visible even when they were invisible. But British radar was large, stationary, and designed for defensive operations over home territory. What the Americans needed in the Pacific was something mobile, something that could be deployed to jungle islands with no infrastructure, something that could survive humidity, heat, insects, and constant bombardment. They needed radar that could go to war. The SCR-270 mobile radar unit was the answer. It looked like a collection of metal scaffolding and wire mesh, a makeshift antenna array that seemed too fragile for the jungle. But it worked. By late 1942, SCR-270 units had been shipped to Guadalcanal and set up in hidden positions near Henderson Field. Operators, most of them barely trained, learning as they went, sat in front of oscilloscope screens watching for the faint green blips that meant incoming aircraft. At first, the system was unreliable. Tropical storms created false returns. Mountains distorted signals. Operators misread screens or failed to communicate fast enough with fighter directors. The Japanese continued their night raids, seemingly unaffected. But gradually, the Americans learned. They refined their procedures. They learned to distinguish weather from aircraft, to calculate altitude and speed, to vector night fighters towards unseen targets using only radio directions and glowing dots. And they stopped telling the Japanese.
On the night of January 17, 1943, Sergeant Moss sat hunched over his radar screen, eyes locked on the 18 dots approaching from the northwest. He had been tracking them for 20 minutes. Altitude 8,000 feet, speed 180 knots, distance 70 miles and closing. He keyed his radio. Cactus Control, this is Radar Station 2. I have bandits inbound, bearing 320, range 70 miles, count 18 aircraft. In the fighter director's tent, the information was received and processed in seconds. 4 P-38 Lightnings and 6 F-4F Wildcats were already airborne, circling in a holding pattern at 10,000 feet. The pilots had taken off blind, climbing into total darkness with nothing but their instruments and trust in the ground controllers. Now those controllers began issuing vectors. Nighthawk Leader, come left to heading 290, targets at your 12 o'clock, 20 miles, Angels 8. The American pilots acknowledged and turned. They could see nothing. The darkness was absolute, but they trusted the voices in their headsets, trusted the invisible technology that was guiding them toward an enemy they could not see. Lieutenant Commander Itaya felt the first prickle of unease when his radio operator reported unusual chatter on American frequencies. Routine, probably. Americans always scrambled fighters at night, uselessly. They would fly in circles, burn fuel, and land frustrated. It had happened dozens of times. But then the sky tore apart. Tracer fire, streams of glowing red and orange lanced through the darkness from above and behind. Itaya's bomber shuddered as rounds punched through the fuselage. He threw the aircraft into a dive, reflexes taking over, but the tracers followed. Beside him, another bomber exploded in a flash of yellow flame that lit the clouds like lightning. Then another. The night, which had been silent and protective, became a killing field of invisible predators. The American fighters were on them, in the dark, without searchlights, without flares, as if they could see. Panic spread through the Japanese formation. Pilots broke formation, diving, turning, trying to escape into the darkness that had always protected them. But the darkness was no longer empty. Radar had painted them, and American pilots, guided by calm voices on the radio, hunted them down one by one. 6 Japanese bombers were shot down that night. 6 more were damaged so severely they barely limped back to Rabaul. Only 6 returned unscathed. The mission was a catastrophe. In the debriefing rooms at Rabaul, the surviving crews struggled to explain what had happened. How had the Americans found them? How had fighters intercepted them in total darkness? Some pilots speculated about new technology. Others believed it was impossible, that perhaps American spies had leaked their flight plan. A few whispered about supernatural intervention, that the Americans had made a pact with unseen forces. Japanese intelligence officers analyzed the reports and reached the correct conclusion: radar. The Americans had deployed airborne interception radar, and they had learned to use it effectively. But understanding the problem did not solve it. Japan had radar too. They had even developed their own systems before the war, but they had not prioritized it, had not integrated it into their operational doctrine, had not trained their forces to operate in a radar environment. Their entire night bombing strategy had been built on the assumption of American blindness. That assumption was now dead. Over the following weeks, Japanese night raids over Guadalcanal dwindled and then stopped. The psychological impact was devastating. Pilots who had once flown with confidence now flew with dread. The night, which had been their sanctuary, had become a trap. They could not see their hunters, could not anticipate the attacks, could not fight back against an enemy that existed only as a voice on the radio and a burst of tracer fire from the void. American commanders noted the change with grim satisfaction. Radar had not just defended Henderson Field, it had broken Japanese air superiority after dark. The technological advantage was not merely mechanical, it was psychological. It shattered the illusion of invincibility that had sustained Japanese night operations. The green glow of the radar screen became a symbol of something larger. It represented a shift in the nature of warfare, a transition from the age of human senses to the age of electronic perception. For thousands of years, warriors had relied on eyes, ears, and instincts to detect enemies. Darkness was a natural barrier that favored the bold and the skilled. But radar changed the equation. It made darkness irrelevant. It turned the invisible visible. Japan had built its military doctrine on scarcity, limited resources, limited manpower, limited options. Every plane, every pilot, every mission was precious. The Japanese fought with the desperation of a nation that knew it could not afford to lose. Darkness had been a way to stretch their limited assets, to multiply the effectiveness of each bomber and each crew. America, on the contrary, fought with abundance. Abundance of factories, abundance of technology, abundance of trained personnel. Radar was not a luxury, it was standard equipment. Every airfield had it, every ship had it, every squadron expected it. The Americans did not fight harder, they fought smarter, with tools that turned nature itself into an ally.
To the Japanese soldier, raised in a culture that glorified sacrifice and endurance, this abundance was incomprehensible. How could a nation produce so much so quickly? How could they field technology that seemed like magic while simultaneously fighting wars in Europe, Africa, and across the Pacific? The answer lay not in superior courage, but in superior systems, democratic capitalism, mass education, industrial innovation, and a society that rewarded problem-solving over rigid tradition. The radar screen, glowing green in a darkened tent on a jungle island, was a product of that system. It was the culmination of thousands of scientists, engineers, factory workers, and soldiers working toward a common goal, coordinated not by imperial decree, but by decentralized ingenuity and pragmatic adaptation. It was the opposite of Bushido. It was the opposite of spiritual warfare. It was cold, mechanical, and devastatingly effective. The night raids over Guadalcanal did not resume. By February 1943, Japanese air operations in the Solomons had shifted entirely to daylight, where they faced overwhelming American fighter superiority. The losses became unsustainable. Rabaul, once the fortress from which Japan dominated the region, became a besieged outpost. The tide of the Pacific War turned not in a single climactic battle, but in a series of incremental technological and logistical victories. Radar was one of them. For the Japanese pilots who survived, the memory of that night in January remained. The memory of flying through darkness that was supposed to protect them, only to be torn apart by invisible enemies. The memory of watching their comrades explode in flames, not because they had made a mistake, but because the Americans could see them. The memory of realizing that the night no longer belonged to Japan. In the decades after the war, historians would analyze the conflict through the lens of strategy, logistics, and grand campaigns. They would discuss Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But for the men who flew those missions, the war often turned on smaller moments. The moment when the assumptions you had trained with, the doctrines you had trusted, the advantages you had relied upon, all of them vanished in an instant. The moment when you realized that the enemy was not just strong, but fundamentally different in how they thought, how they organized, and how they fought. Radar did not win the war by itself, but it represented something that did: the transformation of warfare from an art into a science, from a test of individual valor into a contest of industrial systems. Japan had entered the war believing in the superiority of the warrior spirit. They ended it confronting the superiority of the assembly line. On a humid night in January 1943, 18 Japanese bombers flew into darkness, confident that it would shield them. Instead, they flew into a new kind of warfare, one where machines extended human perception beyond the limits of flesh and instinct, where technology collapsed the natural barriers that had defined combat for millennia. The green dots on the radar screen were not just aircraft, they were the future, a future where darkness offered no sanctuary, where surprise required more than courage, where victory depended as much on the laboratory as the battlefield. The Japanese believed the night protected them. They were wrong. And that error, repeated across 1,000 missions and 1,000 nights, became part of the larger reckoning, the realization that Japan was not fighting soldiers, it was fighting a system that could see in the dark, produce in abundance, and innovate without limit. The radar screens glowed green, painting every shadow, and the shadows, once so comforting, became nothing more than targets waiting to be found. In the end, the night did not belong to the bold. It belonged to those who could see.